welcome to the panel Animal in Myth, Legend and Fairy Tale. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Juliana Leibold. So I'm going to say a few words about her. So Juliana is currently completing a master's degree in environmental policy at the Sciences Po in Paris. Today's presentation is the thesis she submitted to her BA in Language, Literature and Culture with the subjects English, Sociology and Politics from the Justus Liebig University in Gießen. The topic of today's paper was inspired by a semester abroad in Ireland, spent at the University College Cork, and her research interests were further developed during her work as a student assistant at the Interdisciplinary Research Institute, IK3R, where she worked for 2 years, assisting with the literary research and editing, translation and submission of articles on the human-animal nature relationship. In addition, she has co-translated and supported the editing of Katharina Amelie's monography, Multi-Species Ethnography, Methodology of the Holistic Research Approach of Human, Animals, Nature and Culture. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Firstly, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity to the organizers to present this today. And thank you overall to everyone for the interesting presentations and for the very friendly atmosphere at the conference. So my presentation focuses on the complex interactions between human and animal and nature actions in Irish fairy tales. And in my bachelor thesis, on which this presentation builds, I analyzed the 3 fairy tales, Fionn, the Salmon of Knowledge, and the Wing of Witzany. Sorry for the pronunciation, I'm not an Irish speaker, I wish I was. And using Julian's Grimer's attention model combined with Bruno Latour's action network theory, I analyzed those tales. And for this presentation, I will focus mainly on the analysis of one of the tales because of the limited time, the Salmon of Knowledge, before presenting the results of the comparative analysis of the 3. And taking an eco-narratological approach, I will highlight the interconnectedness between nature and culture, which shapes these narrative networks, and I will connect these narrative networks to the concept of webs of reciprocal relationships present in different indigenous cosmologies. And lastly, considering characteristics of the oral storytelling tradition and native science, I ask how the selected Irish fairy tales portray the concepts of nature and culture, and in how far they document indigenous practices of learning with and becoming with the modern human world. I'm sorry, it's a little bit heavy on sociology. So the fairy tale is considered one of the most famous and loved and influential literary genres, as also one of the oldest narrative traditions, as before it existed in its written form, orally shared fairy tales were present in nearly every culture. Fairy tales tend to pass classical genre barriers because of their continual evolution inherent to oral transmission, which characterized them. And this is especially true for Irish fairy tales, which are shown to flow seamlessly from myth to legend to history, blending various storytelling elements. Tales fit the definition of an explanatory tales, as their stories try to explain the natural world of Ireland and the origin of the Irish. And Irish fairy tales are considered particularly original amongst European folk tales. And as Vito Carassi states, Ireland stands out as a nation that has managed to preserve the most conspicuous and significant traditional patrimony and the strictest relationship between it and its literary reworking. Fairy tales can also be interpreted as a narrative tradition that is documenting and conveying experiential cultural learning, as they've been molded over centuries through reciting and retelling, and have hence, and I'm quoting Stephen Jones, achieved a basic narrative form that is a distillation of human experience. Aaron James and Eric Morel highlight oral storytelling tradition as an essential medium that relies on physical proximity and engages the body in the transmission and comprehension of narratives. And because of this, they're seen as able to document the potentially dynamic relationship a culture has to a specific place or its natural environment overall. The transmission and creation of Irish fairy tale was overall inherently open access, open-end and bottom-up in its early oral stages. And Vito Carassi also suggests that the pre-Christian and indigenous dimension of Irish society allowed for a broader range of possibilities and a deeper connection with spiritual and natural aspects of existence. And this is contrasted with limitations and barriers imposed by colonization and Christianity. In the age of modernity, the oral tradition was weakened significantly as philosophical movements and modern scientific advances questioned speculative, experiential, and subjective knowledge, and the educated elite sought to establish the ideological and cultural authority through literary and scientific discourse. And Medard Samadze states this development as significant for the loss of the harmonious coexistence with nature and the individual's capability of free emotional expression. In order to examine the concept of webs of reciprocal relationships in the analyzed fairy tale, I turn to indigenous theories and native science. This will be a very brief overview because, of course, this field is huge. And I have to say at this point as well that there is limited publications on indigenous theories, primarily because many indigenous peoples have had limited access to international research and publication opportunities. And this is also connected to the hegemonic position of Western science, which internationally controls what is considered science. And of course, colonialism also played a significant role in the repression and destruction of indigenous knowledge and thought. One notable difference between Western science and native science that I want to draw your attention to is the lack of strict boundaries in native science. While Western tradition separates natural and social sciences very strictly, this separation is currently also in Western research discussed as a hindrance to science and the Anthropocene, and I will come back to this later. Native science emphasizes the observation as a fundamental element that informs knowledge and ways of acting. The emphasis is on being present, experiencing, perceiving, and documenting one's own knowledge and experiences, and this approach may lead to a different understanding of human beings and their place in the world, with indigenous people typically exhibiting a less hierarchical view of superiority over animal and nature. Indigenous theories and the underlying cosmologies challenge hierarchical frameworks and promote a more holistic and relational understanding of the world and human nature interactions in it. These cosmologies also emphasize the interconnectedness of all beings within an environmental system, which is often called a web of reciprocal relationships. And Kyle White describes this as relatives that have responsibility to support the conditions needed for other relatives to practice their roles within a system of relationships that produce important environmental outcomes. And this is what we will be looking at. So all actors are viewed as able to interact and influence each other, and animals and nature receive agency. These worldviews are also clearly visible in indigenous declarations, such as the Mystic Lake Declaration of 2009. And these ethics of entanglement, as Gigi Adair calls them, promoted by indigenous understandings of nature and education, might lead us to understand culture as something nature does. In Irish fairy tales, the Irish landscape is often portrayed as a guardian, protecting its resources and upholding justice. The Din Shen Cha, Celtic animism, fairy-human environmental relations, and the motive of the other world, Tirnaok, the fairyland, which is closely tied to natural spaces and phenomena, and which can be interpreted as giving agency to the reciprocity and intersubjectivity of nature, make Irish fairy tales very interesting in this context. Agency is also a crucial aspect of environmental storytelling, and traditional narrative theories tend to exclude non-human agency. But in the context of econarratology, recognizing the agency of non-human and inanimate entities allows for a more comprehensive analysis of storytelling about nature. And as I said before, I used Geerdes Julian's Grimer's potential model, which many of you probably know better than I do because I've since moved on to a different area. But just so that we're all on the same page, there's basically two schema. We have the subject to object schema, and we have the sender to object to receiver schema. And while the subject to object schema is usually a narrative where a subject, the agent, performs an object on the patient or target, the sender to object to receiver schema focuses on narratives involving the transmission of something from a sender to receiver, which might be knowledge, a basic object, or even more abstract concepts. And the focus of transitivity in Grimer's model, which is based on a dualistic worldview and closely tied to anthropocentric assumptions, can be viewed as limiting when trying to move beyond the subject-object binary and explore the interconnectedness of human and non-human realities in shaping narratives and understanding the world. Because of that, considering non-human characters as actants, according to Bruno Latour's actor network theory, and incorporating this in Grammar's model, can open the way for new analyses in iconarchaeology, as we will see in my analysis. And I will now give you an overview of my analysis of the tale, The Salmon of Knowledge. And I have to mention that, sadly, I worked with translated versions of all tales, and it's obviously possible that there's information, symbolism, or stylistic devices that have been lost in the process of translation, especially since translating originally Irish fairy tales poses a great challenge because of their deep interweaving with language and culture. The Salmon of Knowledge functions as the origin tale of Fionn, the leader of the Fianna, which we will hear much more about in a moment from the actual expert on this. It tells the story of Fionn's acquisition of the world's entire knowledge, which he obtains accidentally when cooking the salmon of knowledge for his mentor, Finnegas. In the exposition of the tale, the Salmon of Knowledge is introduced as living in a still dark pool in the shade of the overhanging hazel trees. It was the result of eating these nuts of these magical trees that the salmon had acquired the knowledge of the world. This contrasts with the limitations of even the wisest human beings, as Finnegas is described as knowing more about the world, including the secrets of the birds and animals and plants and stars, than any other man in Ireland, while still he did not know everything. A prophecy Finnegan relates to Fionn, his student, states that whoever consumes the salmon will receive this knowledge, but it turns out later actually that the salmon doesn't need to be eaten, but that the knowledge is already transmitted when Fionn touches the fish, and because he burns his thumb, takes the fish as he places his thumb in his mouth. So we have rather a point of contact than an actual eating of the fish. As mentioned previously, the opening of the tale introduces the more than human world as having secrets, the secrets of the birds and animals, plants and stars. And here we can draw a parallel to the other world, a realm of nature beyond human control or comprehension, where the boundaries between the human realm and the spiritual realm are blurred. And the salmon, being a fish, is strongly connected to the element of water, which is frequently associated with the other world. And the magical hazelnut trees connected to the ground and water by their roots are another connection to the underground Tiana Oak. In Celtic mythology also, the hazelnut tree is often associated with wisdom and mystical knowledge, and in other versions of the tale, the connection to the fairy folk is actually confirmed directly, as you can see in this quote. The salmon has immense influence on both the human characters in the tale, as Finnegas, moving to the River Boyne, adapts a big part of his life to catching it, and Fionn's later interaction with the Salmon of Knowledge has profound impact on his life and destiny. Fionn's connection to the hazelnut, which held the knowledge before, is also evident in the fact that in later tales his shield is made from hazelwood. Without the expansion of Grammar's model using ANT, the analysis of the tale could look as follows, which is very simple. We have just different subjects performing actions on the objects. So, for example, the salmon of knowledge or the knowledge of the world. In this case, we can see that the salmon is considered an object without any agency or influence, but using ANT and incorporating the salmon as a non-human acting with agency, the structure becomes much more complicated and diverse. We now have, for example, a situation where previously the salmon as a subject consumes the hazelnut. We also have the transmission of the knowledge of the world to Fionn rather than just a pure consumption. So the salmon actually gives the knowledge of the world as the sender to the receiver, Fionn. But we can even incorporate the hazelnut as another non-human actant, because it previously, as an inanimate entity, transmits the knowledge of the world to the salmon. And now we actually have a chain of action that doesn't even include a human actant. So the transmitted knowledge links natural, animal, and human actants, and the acquisition, possession, and transmission of knowledge is identical for the non-human and the human characters. Fionn's interaction with the salmon of knowledge and the profound impact it has on his life signifies the potential for meaningful connections between human and non-human beings. And this also aligns with Celtic animistic beliefs, attributing agency and sentience to elements of the natural world, including trees, rivers, and animals. And the element of the hazelnut suggests that there is inherent knowledge and wisdom in nature itself. when the tale clearly states as well that the natural world holds secrets and insights, and these secrets are shown to be accessed by those who interact with the nature. This connects to the native science or indigenous knowledge, which, as mentioned before, centralizes observation and experiential research and knowledge acquisition. And the theme of acquiring through multi-species knowledge through multi-species interactions and entanglement align with the concept of interspecies co-evolution and Donna Haraway's concept of becoming with. According to Haraway, if we appreciate the foolishness of human exceptionalism, then we know that becoming is always becoming with. Even if that is not Fionn's own intention as he acquires the knowledge accidentally, after his interaction with the salmon, Fionn is changed completely. And to summarize, the tale shows that interactions with the modern human world and knowledge acquired through these interactions can profoundly shape a person. It furthermore shows that knowledge is not portrayed as something human-specific, but as something inherent in nature and able to cross species borders. And the non-human animal is actually portrayed as holding more knowledge than one of the wisest humans, which opposes human superiority claims. In some later tales about Fionn, he also is described as placing his thumb in his mouth when he needs to access the knowledge, which is firstly quite funny. Yeah. Imagining a warrior, soldier, leader sucking his thumb on the battlefield. But it also shows him returning to this point of multi-species contact when he's in search for guidance. And after this exemplary analysis, I want to present my overall findings from the analyses of the three fairy tales, Hutkova and Salmon of Knowledge and the Wing of the Chain. And although one can find certain characteristics that are overall classical for the genre of fairy tales, as for example, a strong focus on morality in Hutkova, the boundaries to other narrative traditions and folklore are blurred, as typical for the Irish fairy tale. And characteristics of the explanatory tale in these fairy tales are especially visible. One prominent theme is the openness to the unknown, experience, the unsubconscious, and the interaction with the other. And Mhurchú, often associated with the other world in Irish fairy tales, plays a significant role in all three narratives, symbolizing transformation and fluidity of boundaries. In their interaction with the modern human world, characters undergo physical and or metaphysical transformations, and this highlights fluidity and interconnectedness and challenges rigid categorization. In all tales, the human characters exhibit complex relationships with nature, animal, and the other world, and non-human actors play a crucial role in the narrative. They are portrayed as having agency and sentience, and they influence the events of the stories and the human characters. The interaction between non-human and human actors shape the narratives. Knowledge and memories, in the case of the Wooing of Witzany, are shown to be able to cross species borders. And multi-species entanglement highlights the interconnectedness between the actors in the narrative network. The judgment of the well and inanimate actors in the tale of Hutkova, for example, connects the narrative networks directly to the concept of webs of reciprocal relationships in indigenous cosmology and suggests a parallel between the actors in the narrative and the relatives connected in this web, which hold responsibility for each other and the environmental outcomes resulting from their actions. Names also serve as powerful symbols that connect characters to the natural world, reinforcing their identities and influencing their interaction. And the connection between names, knowledge, and nature underscores the notion of a profound bond between language, cultural identity, and the forces of the natural world. All three narratives also emphasize the importance of storytelling as a means of preserving cultural heritage and connecting the past and present. The existence of multiple versions of the tales also demonstrate the dynamic nature of all storytelling and the collective authorship. Passed down through generations, these narratives reflect the resilience and resistance of Irish cultural memory against English colonial oppression, oppression of the Irish language, and cultural assimilation, as, for example, the Celtic animism and the connection to the Dinshenra are still clearly visible in the narratives, especially in the Wooing of Witzany. As mentioned before, the substructure of a fairy tale is the culture of the people. And according to Columbus Obuya, myths and tales can serve as means of cultural surviving, preserving and transmitting indigenous knowledge and values and worldviews. Historical, cultural, and cognitive perspectives are very important for understanding fiction and separating it from factual narration. So narratives that one group would interpret as fiction can be read as factual by another group belonging to a different time or culture. And it's possible that elements which we interpret as fictional today were viewed as rather factual when those narratives originated. The tales also reflect a pre-Christian and pre-colonial openness to experience and interpretation. And as typical for Irish fairy tales, the narratives provide an experience and intuition-based reading of the world, which can be connected to native science. To conclude, selected fairy tales embody a narrative transition that transcends more entertainment. They serve as cultural repository, preserving and representing Indigenous knowledge and cosmology, as well as concepts of native science. The tales highlight the interconnectedness of nature and culture and exhibit networks of actors that represent webs of reciprocal relationships. They clearly display themes of interconnectedness, transformation, experiential learning with and becoming with the more natural world. And in today's context, they can inspire and inform ecological thinking, and they can also help us explore and embrace reciprocal relationships with nature as we navigate contemporary environmental challenges. Obviously, the results from the analysis are limited to 3 selected fairy tales, and for a more conclusive study with more significant results for the overall genre of Irish fairy tales, many more tales would have to be analyzed. I find it very interesting in the context of the Anthropocene, in which the nature-culture dichotomy is increasingly seen as a hindrance to science and research on climate change. And I would also be very interested in research on the parallel between Irish fairy tales and contemporary aspirations in citizen science, as well as on the influence of Irish fairy tales on students' views of nature and culture in modern education, especially since I see a beautiful connection between the tale of Pia Uska and the Economic Nobel Prize winner Eleanor Ostrom's work on the tragedy of the commons. And I want to finish with a quote from the British mycologist Merlin Sheldrake in his book Untangled Life, which deals with fungi. As he says, our relationships with microorganisms could not be closer. As we learn more about such connections, our experience of our own bodies and our place in the world changes. We are an ecosystem that leap boundaries and transcend categories. Our eye grows out of an intricate web of relationships that we only gradually come to know. Thank you very much.
I will introduce now our second speaker. She will be Mhurchu. Thank you. A senior lecturer and head of the Department of Modern Irish in University College Cork. Her research interests include the Fionn cycle, the study of Irish manuscripts and Irish folk poetry. She's particularly interested in the Fionn narrative poems about Mhurchú and the piano, and has published a number of studies on this topic. She's co-editor of the Gaelic Fionn Tradition 2, a collection of essays on the Fionn cycle published in 2022 by Focus Press, and is currently working on a monograph on the poetry of the Fionn cycle.
So I'll be talking about the Fionn cycle today, and you've already got a taste from Juliana. The story of the salmon of knowledge belongs to that categorization, I suppose. But I'll briefly explain anyway what's meant by the Fionn cycle. It's a body of lore and narratives centred on the figure of the warrior, Fionn, and his followers, the Fianna. It's a very long, rich and diverse tradition. It consists of written texts and material collected from oral recitation, long and short texts, poetry, prose, prosimetrum, which we heard about in Catherine's talk, place name lore, and much more. So in this talk, I want to draw attention, again, like Juliana, to the Fionn cycle as an excellent source for the study of the Irish animal, both real and imaginary. So Fionn and his Fianna spent much of the time in natural surroundings, interacting with animals, both domesticated and wild. Sometimes they themselves are likened to animals, and in some cases the Fionn cycle seems to reject the absolute division of human and animal. Scholarship on the Fionn cycle has much to say about the importance of landscape and the natural world within it, but I do think the texts are taking on new resonances in the 21st century with our experiences of living in the Anthropocene, so I'll have something to say about that at the end of the paper. Now, the narratives of the Fionn cycle are obviously fictional, although some practitioners and early scholars did believe that Fionn actually existed, apparently. But of course, this has implications for what they tell us about the animal world. Now, today, my focus will mostly be on imaginary animals, but I will mention at this point, just out of interest, some work by other scholars on the Fionn cycle, which is added to our knowledge of real world human-animal interaction. So, for example, Damien McManus of TCD has written a very interesting study on hunting practices in Gaelic Ireland, drawing extensively on poems and texts from the Fionn cycle. So while the texts are obviously fantastical, it appears that they do contain quite detailed information about how hunting practices were carried out. So that study was published in the journal ISWÜ in 2018. I'll be referencing various works. I didn't put a bibliography together, but you're welcome to email me if you're curious about anything I mention. Another person who's worked in this area is Professor Elizabeth Fitzpatrick of Galway, a geographer. She's looked at landscapes of the Fionn cycle, hunting grounds in other areas, and has found that the texts and the real landscape do in fact correspond to a good degree. And again, a recent study by a woman named Sharon Arbuthnot has studied a Fionn cycle poem as a source for ornithological terminology, a poem that contains a long list of bird names. So again, we see, I suppose, real ecological knowledge encoded within these very fictional poems. And that study is to be found in the book The Gaelic Tradition too, mentioned there by Camille. So that's real world information. So I return now maybe, well, place names, maybe I'll say something about place names. So Fionn and Fianna travel all over Ireland, and they appear to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the land and all the animals that inhabit it. In my abstract, I mentioned the modern English language poem by Austin Clarke, The Blackbird of Derry Cairn. It's quite a well-known poem. It was on the Leaving Cert course in Ireland for years. So it is strongly influenced by a Fionn cycle poem that features Fionn going on an adventure in Norway when he finds a blackbird. He deposits it in the wood of Derry Cairn. So we find this pattern or a particular animal associated with a particular spot in Ireland, elsewhere in the Fionn cycle. So one example is a poem about the favourite things of Fionn. That gives a long list. I'll just read out some examples. He mentions he loves the warbling of the blackbird of Letterlee, the belling of the stag from Momead, the bellowing of the fawn from Glanballval, and so on. So these places are defined by the presence in them of specific animals and poems. Fionn seems to sort of navigate Ireland through his knowledge of these animals. So I suppose, again, another example maybe of some level of realism as far as we know. These things match up, that the places mentioned would seem to have had these animals in them at some point in history, although of course a lot of the place names can be difficult or impossible to identify. So that's real or real-ish aspects of the cycle. Now I'm kind of moving more towards imaginary aspects. So a lot of scholars have remarked on the Fianna on their role outside of human society. So in the 1940s, Marie-Louise Siostet discussed them as heroes living outside the tribe, and Joseph Nage applied the theory of liminality to them in the 1980s. That said, they're not entirely wild. Fionn Mhurchú is typically represented as inhabiting the Hill of Allen, and he enjoys feasts and poetry and music, so the fruits of civilization, I suppose. But they do spend a lot of time in the wild interacting with animals, and in many ways they're defined by these animal interactions. Sometimes they're associated with wolves, taking on the wolf's role as apex predator, killing deer in their hundreds and thousands. But elsewhere, the hunter-huntee relationship is complicated by human-animal transformations. They're quite common in the world of Fianna, and I'll mention some examples. So first, maybe the biography of Oisín. I think Laurent had a mention of this or a similar maybe tale in his slides. So Oisín is one of the best known characters of the Fionn cycle. He features in the famous story of Tír na nÓg, but in many other tales as well and poems. So Oisín's mother is one of these. We have a lot of examples in the cycle of women who transform into deer and vice versa. Oisín's mother is one of these. There are allusions to this idea of Oisín's mother being a deer in early texts. We get the fullest version in a relatively late form, an 18th century lay called the Lore and Upbringing of Oisín. So the 18th century is relatively late, I suppose, for the Fionn cycle. So what happens is the Fianna go out hunting one day, and Fionn is overcome by desire for a hind. Many of the texts specify that this is an enchanted woman, and Fionn fathers a child on this hind/enchanted woman. The text itself isn't actually comfortable with the situation. It's described as scandalous, I suppose, understandably. But then I think it becomes more interesting moving on. We learn that Oisín was born of this deer, but in human form. He was born among the branches and the trees, and he's reared for 7 years on his deer mother's milk and spends a total of 21 years living in the wild with his deer. It's only then when he's discovered by one of his human kin that he goes back to Fionn and the Fianna. At first, he doesn't even look like a human being. He's described as a monster or an ogre or a terrible, wild, shaggy man. But it's interesting, when the hounds of the Fianna find him, they drive away the deer herd, and then Oisín states, "Oh, I'm left without a mother." So there seems to be an incompatibility here. He can either be with the deer or with humans. He can't maybe be with both. That said, he retains a sense of loyalty to his dear mother and to animals throughout his life. There are other versions of the tale that describe how Oisín warns his mother when she's in danger of being killed during a hunt. So in the context of this conference, what does this tell us about animals? Of course, as a topic that has already come up, is that animal figures often maybe focus more on the human than the animal. And we can see this deer figure as symbolizing the marginalized presence of women in the Fionn cycle. She sort of displaces the human mother that Oisín otherwise would have to have in his biography. But that said, we also see empathy with animals, a recognition of a certain kinship, although it doesn't seem to survive contact with broader human society. We see, as with the bears we had yesterday, maybe the experience of maternality as having features that are shared between human and animal. And it has to be said, it seems that the dear mother has been quite successful. Oisín goes on to have a wonderful heroic career among the Fianna and so forth. So that's one tale. So now I might focus on some texts where Fionn and the Fianna have interactions with domesticated or captured animals. There are so many animal references in the Fionn cycle, it's impossible to cover them all, so I'm focusing on certain ones I find interesting. So generally, they're happy to hunt, kill and eat wild animals, but they're not always comfortable with the idea of capturing or domesticating animals. So we see this in the story of Fionn's favourite hunting dogs, Bran and Skiolan. They're treated nearly like human characters. They're able to communicate through their sounds. They're highly intelligent and they're deeply loved. So the tale of how Fionn acquires hounds features human-animal transformation, again with some echoes of the tale we already discussed. The version I'm referring to features in an early modern tale, the Feast of the House of Conan. So Fionn's aunt, Furna, is pregnant and with twins, and she's turned into a hound by a jealous love rival. And then she gives birth to two puppies. This forms part of a longer narrative. I won't go into it, but the magic is eventually reversed. Furna becomes human again. But Fionn says he would rather leave his cousins in dog form. He says, if I were their father, I would prefer that they remain like that than become human. So they remain dogs forevermore. Furna goes on to have 3 other sons, and then there's reference to this sort of combined interspecies family, if you will. The 2 dogs who have 3 human brothers or half brothers maybe. So I suppose we see here that the usual maybe master pet relationship doesn't apply with Fionn and his favourite hounds. They're more like family than friends. So that the Fianna are sort of, they're sort of working with the Fianna rather than sort of serving a purely functional purpose, although of course they're functional as well in that they help out with hunting and so on. Then another narrative that has what I think is a very interesting depiction of captive animals is a less known one named Cuilta and the Animals. It's found in different sources. I'll focus on one version, a lay that has been dated to the early 12th century. It's narrated by Cuilta Mac Ronan, one of the main characters again of the Fianna, known for his swift running. But it's Cuilta behaves in a very unhinged and destructive manner in this particular poem, something which isn't typical for him. So it's a narrative poem, 29 stanzas long, not that long for a Fionn cycle poem as it happens. So it opens with Cuilta boasting of the lively play he has instigated. What is this lively play? He's just headed. And then he speaks of his desires. He wants to let the land go to waste. He wants to inflict weeping on every household in Ireland. He wishes to burn every mill and kill in the land. So, as I said, this level of violence is sort of unusual. So his desires here seem to be kind of an attack on what we might call established society, on domesticity. And as we'll see on animal husbandry, he states that he's let calves go loose to their he's let the calves of Ireland go to their cows, and he has let loose the swift horses of Ireland. So again, I wanted to check real life farming practices as a reference, and there is information on this separation of cow and calf in Fergus Kelly's book, Early Irish Farming, a very important book for the study of the Irish animal, I would say. So in medieval Ireland, calves were taken from their mothers. They were only allowed to suckle twice a day. So I suppose we find a real world agricultural practice referenced to here. So Cuillte seems to be breaking down the normal practices of farmers. He's releasing the horses, letting the calves go back to their mothers as they probably desire. Then he goes to the residence of Cormac MacArt, King of Ireland, where he causes chaos again. He sneaks in and tricks everyone, and he gives the wife of one man to another man, and he gives the wife of the king to another man, and all of this sort of troublemaking. And he recounts all of this very casually, and then we find out that Fionn has been taken captive by Cormac MacArt, so that's probably the reason for his fury. But that said, his response seems to be a bit over the top, causing all of Ireland's suffering for one kidnapping. So then Cormac sets Cuillte what appears to be an impossible task. If he wants Fionn to be set free, he needs to provide pairs of animals from all over Ireland. And again, we find this kind of pairing of place and animals. So there's a long list. I'll just read a couple. So 2 stags from High Eithne, 2 blackbirds from Letted, Lundacharig, 2 wrens from Dulnifa, 2 dogheads from Corrifa, 2 trusks from the Lavoix, 2 turtle doves from Davros, and so on. There's a big long of animal plus place. So Cuillte undergoes a task. It's not easy for him. He's shown as struggling, but he manages it. I think there's an interesting quatrain where he describes his capturing of the crane, and we feel that maybe he has a certain empathy or feeling for the animals he's chasing. He states, quoting, "I caught the crane by the neck, though she did not like it, she came, and I brought her with me under my control to ransom." So again, he seems to feel for this crane who doesn't maybe enjoy the experience of being captured. So the poem ends rather suddenly, but it seems that Cuillte is successful and that Fionn is set free. There is a longer version that gives us more information. This is actually in Scotland in the 16th century book of the Dean of Lismore. Something else to consider with the Fionn cycle. It also belongs to Scotland, and we find Scottish landscapes in there as well. So that's another angle. This version anyway gives a more complete ending. King Cormac is castigated. He's criticised for his desire to acquire the captured animals. The poem reads, quote, "Cormac had no joy of them to see them gathered side by side." So his desire for this sort of menagerie of animals just depicted as something futile, something silly. And then once Fionn is rescued, they actually manage to escape, and they go back, I suppose, to their home places. So again, the whole quest is sort of shown to be a sort of a futile attempt at mastery of wild animals. Of course, this idea of pairs of animals brings the story of Noah's Ark to mind. It was probably an influence. Cuillte maybe could be seen, or maybe Cormac as a sort of an anti-Noah, gathering animals together, not for a good reason, but for a sort of a mad reason. I just think it's interesting because the Fionn are very much outside society in this particular text, and Cuillte seems to be far more in tune with the animals than with all the humans that he has sort of treated quite badly. Again, it's not specified if the pairs are breeding animals, but I think that's probably implied. So in this regard, it's worth thinking back to the section where Cuillte swaps human partners, husbands and wives. He's sort of treating humans here as breeding pairs, like a farmer might do with animals. So I think there's a deliberate sort of a comparison there. So it's quite an extreme tale. The Fionn aren't usually that violent, but I think it's interesting how they're presented as being aligned with animals. Now, we don't know who composed this poem. Nearly all of the poems are anonymous. Whoever they were, we can assume that they enjoyed the products of farming, dairy, meat, other animal-derived goods. They were likely happy with the status quo. I don't think this is a sort of a critique of farming, the social order per se, but maybe rather an example of thinking about animals and the artificiality of farming, an attempt to see the world through not through human eyes, but through those of creatures whose interests may not always be aligned with ours, who have their own inherent existence independently of the human world. So while it is a disturbing poem, with sort of implications of sexual violence, that the poet's level of imagination is impressive. So there is sort of thought about animals within this poem, I believe. So again, as I said, there are many more animals in the Fionn cycle. They're all over the place. But certainly I would suggest if you're interested in putting together a reading list on the Irish animal, the Fionn cycle is worth taking a look at. I put up some text there that are reasonably accessible in the translation, but I have translations if people are interested. So now I'll turn briefly to a separate but related issue, the way we read these animal texts during the current ecological crisis. So Fionn's world is teeming with animals, and wild places. That said, they're always thought of having taken place centuries before the time of composition, so we can't take them too literally. And of course, land has long been an area of contention in Ireland, and even medieval petty kings didn't have such free access to the land as Mhurchú and as Fionn, let alone people of lower classes. So there's always an element of fantasy in this control, and not really control, but sort of freedom to roam the land. So we have to be critical. We can't just see these texts as representing some long lost Eden. That wouldn't really be satisfactory. That said, their depiction of a lush natural world is striking and beautiful and inspiring. And I think it does inspire something of a feeling of eco-angst to the modern reader when we're becoming very aware of the ecological depletion of the world. And Ireland especially, I suppose, growing up, we were always told Ireland was green, but actually it turns out it's one of the most ecologically depleted countries in Europe. So it's literally green, but maybe not figuratively green. And even a lot of the landscapes we create through their natural beauty have actually been profoundly transformed by human practices. So I'm inspired here, especially by Padraig Fogarty's book, Whittled Away Ireland's Vanishing Nature, where he gives a lot of details on different animal species and how they've been depleted over the centuries. Again, I suppose the sheep that I suppose could be taken as symbolising this. They're very beloved of our tourist board. They're one thing that stands out to tourists who visit Ireland, but they do cause a lot of devastation. They prevent plant growth and so on. So maybe they're not as innocent as we've been led to believe. So again, specifically with reference to the Fionn cycle, again, because there are so many Fionn cycle landscapes all over Ireland, many of them have been damaged. So this is the Hill of Allen as it stands today, so you can see it's quite badly destroyed one side of it by this mining operation. And again, another place where Fionn goes hunting a lot would be around Killarney, on the lakes of Killarney. So where Killarney National Park is today. So again, it's not as fun a place as you would think. Just trying to get this to show properly. There's been a lot of discussion of this park in the news recently. There are a lot of problems with the invasive species of rhododendron, which is preventing the growth of other plants. And then there's a problem of the over reproduction of deer as well. There are too many deer, and there are a lot of problems with this park as well. So it'd be naive to think that this wildlife park represents anything really close to what people might have experienced in the past, and that we find indirectly in the Fionn cycle. So I'm not suggesting we should aim to recreate the landscapes of Fionn. It would be impossible and not necessarily desirable. However, I do think it's interesting to read these texts in conjunction with reading Ireland's landscapes, past, present, and maybe into the future. So George Monbiot, in his book Feral, Rewilding the Land, Sea and Human Life, evokes a sense of lots of wilderness he feels in the world, and I think we do find a sense of this wilderness in the Fionn cycle indirectly, not to take it too literally, but you can clearly a lot of the people who composed the text did have a level of experience that probably few people, if any, would have today. Again, another point that Monbiot discusses in that book is the idea of the shifting baseline. Every generation thinks that nature, as it was when they were children, is the correct state, and then that any depletion is a sort of a loss. But maybe they don't realise that if you went back multiple generations, the level of depletion is a lot greater. It's harder to imagine. It's difficult to imagine these things. And so again, I think we can get a sense of that reading the Fionn cycle. Another writer that springs to mind is the Icelandic ecological writer Andri Snare Magnusson. He's written a book on time and water, where he writes very touchingly, again, on our need to sort of think on a wider expanse of time, not just our generation and our grandparents, children, grandchildren, whatever, but to sort of see the bigger picture. Again, I think these older texts can be part of that process, maybe. So yes, I think we can get a sense of wildness through reading texts of the Fionn cycle and other texts, of course, and these can inspire us to ponder what could be done in the future. Do we want to return some of that to the world? How might that be done? However it's done, it'll be quite different to what we've had in the past, but worth thinking about. So to conclude, the Fionn cycle tales and poems are composed mostly for entertainment, really. In most cases, that would be their primary purpose. But I do believe that they contain deep thinking about animals, some expressing the alterity of animals, others exploring interspecies commonalities, always thought-provoking. So there are historical, philosophical, and literary interest, and also in this time of ecological crisis, we can't help but relate them to our own increasingly narrow experiences of the natural and animal world. So in that sense, I think they do speak to us louder than ever. So perhaps we should all go and listen to the song of the Blackbird of Jerry Kern. Thank you.
Thank you for another amazing talk. So much. So we've got until 4:30 questions. Without further ado, then the floor is open for questions.
Yes, first of all, thank you for your great talks, all of you. I have a question to all of you, but I think more to Juliana and Clara. Juliana, in particular, you mentioned water as kind of transformation, and also in your talk, Clara, water played a big role, like grass, lakes, and rivers, and people or beings living in between country or being outside of water or inside of water. What role would you say does water play in the text you mentioned? Well,
I can go first if you want. So I think for me it's a little bit particular because I just focus on one of the 3 fairy tales now. But I think the role of water is the strongest in the way of I'm struggling so much with this because we actually have the character like coming in contact with water, so she's transformed by a jealous ex-wife of her lover, from a fairy of Tiernock to sometimes a butterfly, sometimes a fly, which falls into the cup of a woman who drinks it up, and then she is actually pregnant with a baby that still has connections to the fairy and the butterfly of like being golden hair like the butterfly was, and like she used to be in Tiernock as well. And she can remember all of her memories. They come back to her when she's like confronted by some poetry that revolves around her. And I think there it's just clearly she's like the water just makes all of those borders between the modern human world, which is maybe the fairy world, maybe the animal world, and maybe then the human world. It just makes them disappear because she's literally going from one species to the other. While the important things of like the stories, the memories, and the knowledge, they actually stay with her while she's. So I think it's just very much like the transformation and fluidity there. And since the water is anyway tied to the underground, you know, you have this connection to the other world.
Yeah, that's what I found as well, that actually the escape of the otherworld fairy wife or the otherworld woman often happens through a well or a lake or the sea, often in the mermaid and fisherman type. So there seems to be the potential of the bodies of water to be the portals, basically. And then in Carr's plays, I think, especially in the Midlands play, there's this matrilineal, Melissa Seher, who's a big scholar on Carr, speaks of this matrilineal landscape where water serves this purpose of feminizing also the landscape.
Yeah, thank you all 3 for your papers. And my question kind of picks up on that, the matrilineal line. And you showed very convincingly this kind of the web of references, especially also to earlier female figures in Carr's plays. And I wondered actually about the names of the 2 other female protagonists, Portia and Hester, both of which are very prominent names also in not necessarily Irish literature, but Portia in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Hester in The Scarlet Letter. So I wondered if, you know, apart from the Edmonds, apart from the Irish, whether there's more, or whether this kind of matrilineal line also covers a even wider web of references there, intertextual references.
I think so. I also, for my research in Marina Carr's archive in the National Library in Dublin, it seems that she had this phase of a year at least where she just kept reading on what she considered to be the basic stuff that she needs to know as a playwright. And I think in the Midlands trilogy that came soon after, it's really clear that she's full of this material. And I think it kind of goes away later on, where she either writes her own plays or adaptations of like her own, like creates completely new narratives, or she adapts a specific play or specific novel. And I think the Midlands plays are just these, like, there are so many different references, and certainly Portia has been linked to the Merchant of Venice. With the May, it's not sure. Some people have suggested that it has this Celtic chieftain kind of element because of the use of the definite article, which I don't know if that's actually if someone would argue against that. That's something I've come across, and that she's this chieftain figure. And with Hester, yeah, it's Hester Bryn probably, because she's also an outcast.
And kind of both of them being trapped in the patriarchal societies in their different ways. But
Again, yes, thank you for the panel, and kind of maybe picking up on you. I just was asking you all how much you're aware of, especially maybe the first two speakers, and then I have a suggestion for Clara. But you know, around the turn of the 20th century, and I think up until current times, like women writers in Ireland are trying to kind of make sure that in the, you know, the kind of the revival of the Finn cycle, you know, for nationalist purposes, you know, around the turn of the century, really focused on male warriors. And people like Alice Milligan and Ava Gore Booth and Constance Markovich, you know, were making sure that we didn't forget about Queen Maeve and female warriors, and like the Morrigan, who like really were frustrating the warriors in various ways. And we see this kind of, I think, persisting into 20th century Irish women's writing, especially, and I'm wondering, maybe especially Juliana, if you're aware of Eilish the Great, who she's trained as a folklorist. She has a degree from UCD in folklore, but she's a novelist, short story writer, and she has several collections of short stories where she interweaves, and especially focusing on animals, interweaves like ancient Irish and even sometimes made up legend into like very contemporary narratives. So, I mean, I suppose that's more of an observation than anything, but I just think it's interesting, you know, kind of coming off of what you're saying about the patriarchy, because I would have a suggestion for maybe a possible parallel between the Children of Lear and By the Bog of Cats, whether it persuades you or not, because in all those plays, one of the themes is intergenerational conflict and competition between women, which patriarchy encourages. You know, I mean, it's you know, it's very, very creepy in between Carthage and his mother. You know, she's trying to be the bride, you know, she's there in her bridal gown at the wedding, you know. And of course, the Children of Lear, why they're made into swans is because their stepmother, Aoife, does not want to compete with them. So she turns them into swans. So, I mean, it's a quite very parallel, but I would suggest that maybe that's a possible way of thinking about it as informing on some level, informing the themes, maybe even of the whole trilogy.
I think
that swans come into, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does, tying it to Hester through that parallel with Swan, that wasn't working for me.
Yeah,
it just seemed that that's not what her relationship with Josie was.
Yeah.
About, but yeah, I think, and that's interesting with Mrs. Kilbride.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, even to an extent, you know, Caroline and even Hester are kind of different generations, really. I mean, Hester used to babysit her.
Oh, actually, that's really interesting.
For Caroline, and this is all through all of the trilogy. There's this constant like jockeying for position between grandmothers and granddaughters and mothers and daughters. Like it's a theme that runs very powerfully throughout. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Hi, I've got a kind of broad, thank you for these shape-shifting question. I'm always troubled by and it was for all of you, but I also wanted to ask a specific question about the Finn, your great Finn contribution. So the shapeshifters, you know, quite often it seems like in the stories like Selkies, they get sort of trapped on one side, right? It seems like the preferable side to be on is the human side, and you get your skin confiscated and you can't go back to the elements. It's always sort of and it's a human animal binary that it seems like it's why is the difficulty of being able to go back and forth between, right? That's a troubling idea. But I was thinking, and when you were describing the Fionn cycle, that somehow he doesn't forget the deer. He doesn't forget the deer mother, which when I think about, I'm thinking like Gilgamesh and Enkidu. I don't know if that's a bizarre connection to have made, but Enkidu is very happy with the animals. He gets kind of commandeered by and lured into human society by Gilgamesh and his mother, and he loses contact, and that's the source of all kinds of tragedy later on in that early ancient story. So, but it seemed to me like in the Fionn cycle, at least there was he doesn't forget. What you said was he doesn't forget the mother, and so I guess it's a broader question about the shapeshifter, right, and the role of the shapeshifter, and I guess maybe one way to think about the shapeshifter, I've heard it described as, oh, well, if you want to go back to the animal world, then that's not individuation and that's not becoming fully human. But I think the source of enchantment in the shapeshifter is the ability to go back and forth, right, between the animal and the human. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or if that made some sense, but it's just, I've been thinking about shapeshifter figures for a while and wondering about them.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'll look into that Gilgamesh reference. Yeah, it's well, I mean, there's obviously shapeshifting all over Irish literature, and there's so many different circumstances.
Yeah.
But it's always sort of constrained. You maybe have one shift or two, but not that many. It's
right.
So there's something there. You kind of have to make your choice, and sometimes you have a choice, or sometimes you're shape-shifted, and somebody else shifts you into yeah. So. Yeah, Oisin is kind of a rare character where he seems to a certain point, he sort of overcomes that limitation, he manages to keep something. And as I said, the text I was talking about, it's not one of the better known ones. But I suppose it's interesting to think of it in its wider representation. You know, he's also the one who, he does have something different. He's the one who survived. All the rest of them die, and he goes on to Tirnanog, he comes back, he meets St. Patrick. He obviously has something.
Yeah.
He has this kind of adaptability. So again, so you don't have one biographical tale. You have for Fionn Mhurchú, you have sort of well, there's the boyhood deeds, which has a lot of his life and childhood. With Oisin, there's kind of bits all over the place. So I don't think we've really fully kind of integrated all the lore to form a picture of this character, but I would sort of think that there's something fundamental in that sort of childhood he had in the wild.
Yeah.
And again, that maybe needs to be looked at more. That sort of gives him some sort of, I don't know, flexibility or durability that he can kind of go through all these different shifts and sort of still come out, you know. And he's the one who preserves all the lore as well. So the idea is that he's telling St. Patrick about the Fionn. If it wasn't for him, it would be gone. He's really the one who creates it in a sense, you know. So, but it all comes from a deer, so there's something there.
Yeah.
Maybe if I can just comment on that, I think for me that because there was some shape shifting in the Melusine legends with the mermaid for sure, and when she doesn't have her tail or her comb is taken away by the husband, then she can't shape. But even in the other ones where she is there voluntarily, so there's no item stealing, it seems to be the children and the partner that are kind of keeping her in this world. And when she decides to or has to return, she's confronted with the question of what to do with the children and how to take them with her. And that's usually the issue with the Doubtstones, for example, version, leading to the children being transformed into rocks on the shore and her escaping alone, for example.
Thank you very much. I've been told some of you have brains to catch. You know, able to end the session on time. So thank you so much for a wonderful informative session. And I think we can go on a well-deserved break or
Yeah.
So, yeah, thanks again.
Break
to-
for the train.
Good.